The sky was an ominous gray that morning, a portent of the storm that would soon shake not just the weather, but the hearts of those in a small southern town. Elijah Johnson, a mild-mannered man in his 30s, walked into the quaint diner at the corner of Elm and Main, his shoulders squared with quiet determination. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, he looked like any other working professional looking for a warm breakfast before the day began. Yet Elijah was not just any man, he was black, and in this town that detail was enough to draw stares and whispers. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The restaurant, Mary's Place, had been around for decades. Its faded red sign creaked in the wind, and inside, the aroma of fried bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Patrons sat in vinyl booths, the walls adorned with photographs of smiling faces and local events. To a casual observer, it seemed like a welcoming place, a slice of Americana. But Elijah knew better. The stories about Mary's Place were whispered in the black community like a warning. It wasn't outright racism. They wouldn't hang signs or shout slurs, but they had their ways. People of color were ignored, turned away, or subjected to slow service until they left in frustration. Elijah's arrival was met with an eerie silence. Conversations trailed off and heads turned. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a forced smile, approached him hesitantly. Her name tag read, Darlene. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "Yes," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like a table for one, please." Darlene hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen. Behind the swinging door stood the owner, Mary herself, a stout woman in her 60s with a pinched face. Mary's icy blue eyes locked on Elijah, and a flicker of disdain passed across her features. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and Darlene swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," Darlene said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're full." Elijah looked around the diner. Half the booths were empty, and a few tables had just been cleared. He raised an eyebrow, but remained composed. "It doesn't seem full to me." Darlene fidgeted with the edge of her apron. "We're expecting a big group soon. You might want to try somewhere else." Elijah's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some watching with morbid curiosity, others with thinly veiled hostility, but he stood his ground. "I'd like to speak with the owner." Darlene's face flushed, and she turned toward the kitchen. A moment later, Mary emerged, her hands on her hips. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "No problem," Elijah said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'd just like a seat and a meal, same as everyone else." Mary's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "And why exactly are you refusing me?" Elijah asked, his tone measured. "Is it my attire, my behavior, or is it something else?" Mary's face reddened, but she didn't back down. "I don't owe you an explanation," she snapped. "Now I suggest you leave before this becomes a scene." By now, the tension in the diner was palpable. Some patrons looked uncomfortable, glancing at their plates or the windows as if trying to will themselves invisible. Others smirked, enjoying the confrontation. Elijah, however, remained unshaken. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "I have a right to be here." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mary's eyes darted around the diner, gauging the mood. "Fine," she said at last, her voice cold. "But don't expect any special treatment." She gestured toward a small, wobbly table near the kitchen door, far from the cozy booths and sunny windows. Elijah nodded and took his seat, his back straight and his expression unreadable. He ordered a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee. The food arrived late and lukewarm, the coffee weak and barely drinkable. Elijah ate in silence, his movements deliberate, as if every bite was an act of quiet defiance. What happened next, however, was not part of Elijah's plan. As he finished his meal, a young boy entered the diner with his mother. The boy, no older than 10, had wide eyes and a curious smile. He glanced at Elijah, then at the other diners, sensing the tension in the room but not fully understanding it. His mother, a black woman with an air of quiet dignity, hesitated at the door, her gaze flickering to Elijah. Elijah caught her eye and gave her a small nod, a silent message of solidarity. But before the woman could approach, Mary intercepted her. "Sorry," Mary said, blocking the entrance. "We're full." The woman looked around, her expression a mix of confusion and resignation. "It doesn't look full." Mary's smile was tight and unyielding. "We're expecting a large party." The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, I'm hungry," he whispered. Elijah stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The room went silent again. "They can have my table," he said, his voice carrying across the diner. Mary's eyes narrowed. "That's not how it works," she said sharply. "You can't just—" "I'm done with my meal," Elijah interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "And they need a seat." The woman hesitated, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But Elijah gave her a reassuring nod. Slowly, she led her son to the table and sat down. Mary's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, frustration, and a flicker of something that looked like fear. But before she could say anything, the door to the diner swung open again. This time, it wasn't another customer. It was a reporter, camera in hand, followed by a man with a clipboard and an official-looking badge. Elijah had made a few calls before entering the diner that morning, and now his reinforcements had arrived. The reporter began snapping pictures, capturing the tension in the room, while the man with the badge approached Mary. "We've received complaints about discriminatory practices at this establishment," the man said, his voice authoritative. "We'll need to conduct an investigation." Mary's face turned pale and the diner erupted into murmurs. Some patrons quickly finished their meals and left, while others watched with wide eyes. Elijah remained calm, his expression resolute. The next day, the story was splashed across local newspapers and social media. "Diner refuses service to black customers. Civil rights investigation launched," read the headline. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Protesters gathered outside Mary's place, chanting for justice. Social media users called for a boycott, and the diner's Yelp page was flooded with negative reviews. For Mary, the fallout was devastating. Longtime customers stopped coming, and her once thriving business began to crumble. But for Elijah, the incident was a victory. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been turned away or treated as less than human. Weeks later, Mary's place closed its doors for good, a stark reminder of the cost of prejudice. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his quiet fight for justice, knowing that the road ahead was long but worth every step. And though the storm that morning had been fierce, the sun eventually broke through, casting its light on a town forever changed. The closure of Mary's place sent ripples through the town, and the fallout was both a reckoning and a lesson. Elijah's decision to stand firm was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a broader movement. What happened at the diner was no isolated incident. It was a microcosm of the systemic discrimination that people like Elijah face daily. And while Mary's place became the focal point of attention, the story itself took on a life of its own, traveling far beyond the town's borders. The following weeks saw Elijah thrust into a role he hadn't sought but embraced nonetheless, that of a local leader. Community leaders, activists, and even reporters began seeking him out, eager to hear his perspective. Elijah, ever measured and thoughtful, used the attention not to bask in personal glory but to amplify the voices of those who had suffered in silence. At a community town hall organized a month after the diner's closure, Elijah addressed a packed room. The venue was a modest community center with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. People from all walks of life attended, young and old, black and white, affluent and struggling. The air buzzed with anticipation as Elijah took the stage. "I didn't walk into Mary's place that day to become a symbol," he began, his voice steady but powerful. "I walked in because I wanted breakfast. That's it. Something as ordinary as sitting down to eat should not have to be an act of courage, but it was. And that says something about the world we live in." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others wiping away tears. Elijah continued, weaving his personal experience into a larger narrative about the history of racism in their town. He spoke of the quiet indignities that people of color endure daily, being followed in stores, receiving poor service, and hearing whispers or outright slurs. But he also spoke of resilience, hope, and the possibility of change. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can shape the future." That starts with conversations like this one. It starts with looking at ourselves, our businesses, our schools, and asking, how can we do better? Because we must do better. The applause was thunderous. The momentum from that meeting sparked a series of initiatives aimed at combating racism in the town. Local schools began implementing diversity training programs, and businesses joined coalitions to promote inclusive practices. A black-owned bakery opened in the space where Mary's place once stood. its walls adorned with artwork from local children depicting themes of unity and hope. The bakery became a symbol of renewal, and its grand opening drew crowds larger than the town had ever seen. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself becoming a reluctant figure of inspiration. People approached him on the street, thanking him for his courage. Parents introduced him to their children as an example of integrity and strength. While he appreciated the recognition, Elijah remained humble. "It's not about me," he often said. "It's about all of us." But not everyone welcomed the changes. Some members of the community clung to their prejudices, resentful of what they saw as an attack on their way of life. Anonymous letters began arriving at Elijah's mailbox, filled with hate-filled words and thinly veiled threats. His car tires were slashed one night, and he received phone calls that began with silence before a click ended the line. The pushback, while unnerving, only strengthened Elijah's resolve. One evening, as Elijah sat on his porch, a young man approached him. He was white, in his early 20s, with a hesitant expression. "Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Yes," Elijah replied, motioning for the man to take a seat on the porch steps. I wanted to apologize," the man stammered, his hands fidgeting, "for how I acted at the diner that day. I was one of the people sitting there watching and I didn't say anything. I should have stood up for you." Elijah studied the man for a moment, his expression unreadable. "What made you change your mind?" The young man looked down, his face red with shame. "I saw the articles, the protests, everything. I realized I've been complicit my whole life, just letting things slide because they didn't affect me directly. But they do affect me. They affect all of us." Elijah nodded, his demeanor softening. "Acknowledging that is the first step. What matters now is what you do going forward." The conversation with the young man was one of many that Elijah had in the weeks and months that followed. Slowly but surely, more people began examining their biases and questioning the status quo. It wasn't a tidal wave of change, but it was a start, and Elijah took solace in the fact that progress, however incremental, was still progress. Elijah also began working with local organizations to establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, naming it after his late mother, who had been a teacher and a fierce advocate for education. "My mother believed that knowledge is power," Elijah explained at the scholarship's launch event. "And she taught me that the best way to combat ignorance is to arm ourselves with education and empathy." The fund gained traction quickly, with donations pouring in from individuals, businesses, and even a few celebrities who had heard about Elijah's story. Over time, the scholarship helped dozens of students pursue higher education, many of them becoming leaders in their own right. As the seasons changed, so did the town. It wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but there was a palpable shift in the air. New murals adorned public spaces, celebrating the town's diversity. Festivals were organized to highlight the contributions of different cultures, drawing crowds that rivaled the largest parades. And while some old wounds remained, they were now openly acknowledged, a step toward healing. Elijah often found himself reflecting on the journey. One day, as he sat in the bakery that had replaced Mary's place, he noticed a group of teenagers, black, white, and everything in between, laughing and sharing a table. It was a simple sight, yet profoundly moving. It reminded him of why he had walked into that diner in the first place. Not just for a meal, but for the idea that everyone should have a place at the table. One of the teens noticed him watching and waved. Elijah smiled and waved back, his heart swelling with quiet pride. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. Change was slow, messy, and often painful, but it was happening. Years later, Elijah's story would become the subject of a documentary, shedding light on the systemic issues he had faced and the transformative power of standing up for what is right. It was screened at film festivals across the country, earning accolades and sparking important conversations. Elijah himself remained humble throughout, always redirecting attention to the broader movement and the people who had joined him along the way. "This isn't about me," he said during a panel discussion following the documentary's premiere. "It's about all of us working together to build a world where no one has to fight just to be treated with basic human dignity." And so, Elijah's quiet act of defiance at a small-town diner became a catalyst for change that extended far beyond its walls. His story served as a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, courage, and persistence could light the way to a better, more inclusive future. It was a legacy not just of resistance but of hope, and it inspired countless others to take their own first steps toward justice, one small act at a time. As the years unfolded, Elijah's influence extended beyond the boundaries of his small town. What began as a localized stand against injustice became a symbol for a larger, nationwide conversation about systemic racism and the power of individual action. Elijah found himself invited to speak at universities, conferences, and grassroots events across the country. While he was initially reluctant to step into the national spotlight, he realized that his story could inspire others to confront the challenges in their own communities. One particularly memorable event took place at a prestigious university where Elijah was the keynote speaker for a symposium on racial equity. The audience consisted of scholars, activists, and students from diverse backgrounds. Elijah began his speech by sharing an anecdote about his childhood, how his mother, a teacher, had told him that the world was like a garden. She said gardens thrive when every plant has what it needs to grow, Elijah explained. But too often, certain plants are starved of sunlight or water, not because they're less deserving, but because the system is stacked against them. Our job, she told me, is to fix the system, to tend to the garden so everything and everyone can flourish. The analogy resonated deeply with the audience. After his talk, a long line of attendees waited to shake his hand, ask questions, or simply thank him for sharing his journey. Among them was a young woman who was studying law and had been inspired to pursue civil rights cases after hearing about Elijah's story. "You made me realize the power of standing up even when it feels impossible," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Back in his hometown, the seeds of change that Elijah had helped plant continued to grow. The scholarship fund bearing his mother's name expanded its reach, offering mentorship programs and internship opportunities in addition to financial aid. Elijah often volunteered his time to mentor students directly, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to dream big, even in the face of adversity. The town itself became a model for reconciliation and progress. Local leaders worked to document the community's history, including the painful chapters of segregation and discrimination, ensuring that future generations understood the struggles and sacrifices that had paved the way for change. The Black-owned bakery that had replaced Mary's Place thrived, becoming a cultural hub where people gathered to share stories, celebrate milestones, and envision a brighter future. One day, Elijah received a letter from a teacher in another state who had incorporated his story into her classroom curriculum. The students had written him letters, sharing their reflections and thanking him for his courage. "You showed us that one person can make a difference," one student wrote. Another added, "I want to be like you and stand up for what's right." Elijah read each letter with a mixture of humility and hope. The world was far from perfect, and there was still so much work to be done. But moments like these reminded him that progress was possible. Every conversation, every small victory, every act of kindness and courage contributed to a larger mosaic of change. In the twilight of his life, Elijah often reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple act of defiance in a small-town diner. He never sought recognition or fame, but his actions had left an indelible mark on the world. His story, now etched into the annals of history, served as a testament to the enduring power of resilience, empathy, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves a seat at the table. Elijah's legacy continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The documentary about his life and the events surrounding the diner's closure became a teaching tool in schools across the country. Teachers used it not only to illustrate the ongoing fight against racism, but also to encourage students to think critically about their own roles in shaping a just society. Classrooms were filled with discussions about courage, the importance of standing up for others, and the small but significant ways individuals could combat prejudice in their daily lives. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on how the restaurant's actions will impact the story? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.